Welcome to another episode of As Chess Recommends. Today we are going to talk about Céline and Julie Go Boating by Jacques Rivette. It's from 1974. Altaz has the Criterion release and I have the BFI release. Yeah. So this is probably Jacques Rivette's most famous film and probably the one that most people start with. It's not among my absolute favorites. I thought that after a rewatch it might become one of the absolute favorites, but it's still not one of my absolute favorites, even though I think it's a great film, but I have some minor problems with it. But this is a very kind of a good example of Jacques Rivette's style, how we see these like free kind of performances and the actors get lots of room to develop their own characters, and also the free-flowing camera is very Jacques Rivette-like, and lots of the themes and the playing with the narrative is very typical of Jacques Rivette. Yeah. But I think I could already ask Altaz what he thought about this film. I'm not going to do a plot synopsis for a film like this, so I'll just ask Altaz already what do you think of what you thought of the film.
Yeah, as we discussed, for me it was a little bit disappointing, this film, because it is very highly regarded and highly praised. But like I was sharing, it's not. I see it not as a kind of an objective thing. It's more subjective. That's some of the aesthetics of the film. Um, I didn't really connect with. So this film is very much about being able to participate with the joy and finding charm and excitement in the kind of the travels and the hijinks of the pair, Céline and Julie. And for me, I didn't feel the same way about the two characters, or even the performance for those two characters, as most people do. So it's much more lovable to them. It wasn't as lovable to me. But there are interesting themes in the film that I think definitely be worth discussing. But I also like to always hear someone else's perspective, on something, because that's kind of why we're here.
Well, I do like the both of the main characters quite a bit, and again, my favorite type of characters are the French quirky woman type of characters, although I don't think they are quite as good as in like best Romeo films, for example. But I do really like the two characters. But we could now talk about like what type of people would like this film, as we always do. So again, if you like Jacques Rivette's other weird films, you probably like this. And if you've never seen any Rivette films, but you maybe like David Lynch, or if you like kind of experimental narratives and narratives that don't go from point A to point B, and if you like again playing with the narrative, playing with themes, having like quirkiness and weirdness in your films, I think you would like this film. And again, if you like French cinema, French New Wave cinema, I mean, this is a must watch. Yeah.
Yeah, I see what you're saying about like Lynch and having different kinds of narrative, but this is much lighter. I feel, right, like Lynch's films are heavier, so I felt like it's a much kind of, yeah, if you like, almost like entertainers, because I think it's meant to be very entertaining, uh, albeit with some you know innovation in the construction of the story and time and place and all that. So yeah, I think if you like adventure type things as well, like kind of like it is a bit one of those like entertaining mysteries as well. So yeah, obviously, if you are a fan of Alice in Wonderland growing up, I think this is an interesting um, kind of play on Alice in Wonderland as well, because I think that book factors quite heavily in what is trying to be done in this film. Yeah.
But I would also say to like modern film watchers that this has a very slow pace compared to what you are probably used to. And again, David Lynch films are, I would say, way more kind of traditionally entertaining, and they have a quicker pace, and there are more things happening than in this one, because there are certain scenes in this film that go on for a very long time and they meander. Although then there are other scenes that are like very funny and exciting and interesting. But definitely when you watch the whole film, there might be some scenes when you start dozing off because it's just nothing happens and it's kind of just meandering and repeating itself. But that's kind of the Jacques Rivette thing, that again he makes these like really long films that meander quite a lot.
Yeah, and I think so. One thing is they were they were very limited in budget, so that is going to affect what you can and can't do in a film. But what I gathered from this aesthetic, because I haven't watched a lot of Rivette, so I can't be an expert on Rivette or anything like that. But what I felt is that the aesthetic is not if you're watching a stage play, but almost like if you're watching rehearsals. So it's like a lot of the scenes are constructed in like a bare bones way. So even in terms of even furniture and furnishings around, they can be like very bare bones, and then it can almost be like you're watching rehearsal of before a scene or rehearsal before a play. So I think this is one of the things that probably will get into discussion. I think Rivette is interested in the kind of performance, front stage and backstage, and then kind of searching for authenticity. So in that way, it's much more of an exploration, even though it's presented as kind of a story and entertaining and like an adventure and all that, but it's very much an exploration, I think, of performance and character as well as many other things. So it's as much literary theory as it is a film or dramatic, drama theory and theater theory than it is just a film. So there are all these aspects that could end up feeling trying, like you said, or maybe meandering um, in the film. So the length is definitely going to be a challenge for many people are not just drawn in.
Yeah, and I think again Rivette let the actors themselves to decide some of the dialogue and also improvise a lot, to the point that I think when you look at the script writers for this film, it has some of the names of the actors because they improvised so much. And this point about rehearsing is big in Rivette's films. Like for example, his magnum opus Out One starts with like rehearsal scenes of like couple hours of rehearsing and nothing happens really. So he likes that type of thing. And then we can again, of course, discuss how much this is Rivette's film and how much it is the actor's film, because the actors played such a big of a role in kind of creating the story and the dialogue and what they wanted their performances to be like. Yeah, but I think now we could get into spoilers and we can start with the aesthetic that we already talked about a little bit. So of course Rivette has this kind of a free-flowing aesthetic that the camera moves and floats, and we have this kind of, you could say, maybe slightly sloppy camera movement in places, but sometimes it's even quite methodical too. And one thing I often notice in Rivette films is that the city kind of becomes a character. So when this film begins and we see the two women, again, one of them following the other, like you really get the sense of the city and the streets and the shops and the buildings and the parks and everything. And I really like that element of Rivette's visual style, and of course also lots of the aesthetic inside the house, and everything is pretty interesting at times with where the actors are placed and how they interact with each other and
Mm.
everything like that.
Yeah. So the aesthetic is very, for me, like very en plein air. So it's like very naturalistic. It's it's daylight. I think it can also, in the same way as we discussed before, with the audience, because this is a film that's going to be layered, but choosing to shoot it without markers, as in you are going from one thing to another, which some films do, uh, makes it, yeah, it could make it challenging for certain audience members. But yeah, I do like, I mean, I liked, the shots of the city. I liked, even the things like the setting of the library. uh yeah, I like it. I liked the vibe of it. Like, it's, that summertime. It's Paris. I mean, it's, the city. There's a kind of almost laid back vibe as well, because it is like kind of a holiday season. Um, and people are in a particular mode, so it can put you in that mode of, when you are young and you are, reading a book in the summer and with the sunshine and the heat, and kind of getting, uh, you know into those stories. So yeah, I think that the aesthetic is, that aesthetic is, nice, like the setting and everything. I think it was good. It was really interesting, really nice gardens and stuff like that. The home where the, her kind of home growing up, or the home where the story takes place. So that was all like a really nice, like, home and stuff like that. Uh, so really interesting architecture and stuff like that. Yeah.
And we could maybe already start talking about the narrative and the themes. And I actually read one review that was pretty interesting that talked about the title of this film, especially the French title. And apparently the boating thing doesn't like necessarily mean like literally boating. But I
Hmm.
think if you like switch like one letter of the word or something in French, then it means like illusion or magic or
Hmm.
something like that, or to
Hmm.
lead someone on, because of course this whole movie is about kind of magic and
Hmm.
illusion and identity, world within a world,
Hmm.
character performance within a performance, and things like that. And I think when the film starts, we see one of the women reading a book of spells. So in some
Hmm.
ways, some of these things are kind of like obvious, that you, like you said in the pre-talk, that maybe it isn't as complex as we think. But I think what makes it more complex is that there are so many of these individual things that maybe as an individual thing it isn't as complex, but when you put all of them together, it kind of creates this soup of so many different ingredients. You could say that makes it complex, even though the individual elements maybe aren't as complex.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. It's not even, yeah, and I didn't mean it in a denigrating way, that it's not that complex. I just think, like, uh, I read this review once of another film where the person said, "Oh, like, I enjoyed thinking about the film more than the experience of the film," and that's just, once again, a subjective thing. I didn't necessarily enjoy the experience of the film, but but that doesn't mean the film doesn't have value. It has a lot of value because of what the exploration is. It's that, like you said, like, rearranging the words. It's like, it can be boat, or it can be some of these other things, illusion, and then the other name it god is phantom ladies of Paris. And there's a question mark, right? How, you know what is the lure of a story, in a sense? Because what is really happening is that this character Celine is slowly pulling Julie into a world, or her world. So there are multiple interpretations that are possible. One interpretation that's possible is that Celine is an author. So when we read a book, the author drops. little breadcrumbs that lure us into that story, and it's kind of a magic, right? Because the ability to tell someone a story and pull them in and immerse them in a world, and the world becomes vivid, and the world becomes in some ways more real than the real world or equivalent to the real world. That is magic. um, that is a form of magic. That is one of the kind of magic we have in this world. And in those stories, when we can explore alternate worlds and alternate realities, that is also a form of magic. So the magic connection is there. And then then we can even go into the discussion about these two figures, Celine and Julie, who they are in relation to each other, author and reader, uh, kind of childhood wonder, and flexibility and openness, and then kind of being in your 20s and being on the verge between adulthood and childhood. Or they're just friends, like you and I, we connect over film, and connecting over a story, connecting over an art, connecting over a soap opera, connecting, you and Tony connecting over OC, or any number of things. So there's a multiple ways of reading this film. And absolutely, like, there's no way I would ever take away that credit. That's what it is as an artist, as they came together and came up with this concept. That is a really interesting concept, and it's trying to explore something that's very hard to explore in a very straight narrative. You need dropouts, and you need to change time and worlds and this and that. Like, so it is. I didn't mean it in that way. It's not that complex. I meant that things that the themes maybe aren't hidden per se, and they don't really have to be for a film to be good. But there are layers. So there's a construction. There's an elaborate construction going on. 100%.
And add to the conversation about the two characters, of course, there's this idea of identity and their clashing identity. Like, they sometimes hint that maybe they are the same person. Like when, for example, Julie talks about her, like the guy who she was in love with, but then Céline is the one who goes to meet him in the park, and but then
Exactly.
the guy doesn't really realize that it's a different person, so it's kind of gives you an idea that maybe they are the same person. So that's
One,
obviously
one,
something that very Lynchian idea as well, that we kind of see in Mulholland Drive something quite similar, and in many of Lynch's films like Lost Highway, how the two men kind of switch in the prison and these types of things. So there's the Lynchian connection there.
absolutely. Like when the film started and I was watching it, I turned to my wife and I was like, "Oh, this is Fight Club. Like, this is Fight Club before there was Fight Club." Because and once again, I think these are the things that you're always trying to explain to your audience when you talk about these films, is that you watch all these ideas. So you've seen Fight Club, and you've seen films of the director who shall not be named on this podcast, uh, and these ideas not only have been explored before, but have been explored with that complexity. But when you strip away the other helping hands that you can get from a certain musical score or special effects, um, it is also an interesting to see that just people who are that ambitious for that kind of storytelling. So yeah, 100% in the from the beginning, I was like, yes, there was definitely a question mark. Is Celine like are Celine and Julie are the one person, or Celine is like an alter ego? It's like a construction, right? Because we see her in the library. She's a librarian. She's around these books, and obviously we know Parisians are big readers in general, and especially at that time period. So she's clearly into reading and stories, and she's clearly very bored. It's summertime. Did she construct that narrative to add a little bit of magic, again, magic into her life? So there are all those, and definitely that piques interest, as in, what's going on. One theme that was very briefly kind of addressed very quickly, but I thought was very interesting, is that obviously as we see the film go forward, it melts, right? She almost forgets. She would get asked, "What's your home address?" and she had more and more trouble remembering her address of her childhood home, because that often happens in stories too. As we encounter stories, they come into our world and they interact with our world, and in some way our imagination and our remembrance of our stories get melded with, characters and stuff and stories that we identify with. But there was this one interesting thing where she's visiting a neighbor, uh, whom she grew up next to, and the neighbor starts telling reminding her about her life, about, is commenting on her real life. And she abruptly ends that meeting and says, Julie ends that meeting and says, "Oh, I gotta go, like, I have something to do." And the something to do was to meet Celine outside this uh, home that's, is it illusionary, is it imaginary, or whatever, and then to go and visit that story that they're visiting together, versus sitting there and dialoguing more about her life. So, this stories and stuff providing us an escape too, and even being more interesting to us than our ordinary lives sometimes. um, I thought that was interesting as well.
Yeah, I think to add to that, that maybe when we get so involved with other people and also with stories and art, maybe we gonna lose part of ourselves and who we are as people, and then that story replaces like parts of ourselves, and with that escapism just um, is so riveting to us that yeah, we kind of start losing our reality and our interests in ordinary things, because the art and the other people's lives, those stories are so magical. And then
Yeah,
also
absolutely.
to add to the point about maybe the two women being the same, obviously the ending kind of adds to that as well, when there's the role reversal that now it's Céline who sees Julie dropping those things, and then she has to go after her, and then the film
Mhm,
kind of abruptly ends.
mhm.
Yeah, so that kind of adds to it a lot as well. So,
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that there's, yeah, there's so much in that, what you're saying, between like the interplay of the two characters, and then, yeah, and also how they're interacting with this world, and how this world came to be. So it's interesting, right? It's like like you said, it's a film. It's very meta, right? It's like you said, it's a film in a film in a film, and performance in a performance in a performance, story in a story in a story. Because when you see initially, she sees on Julie, on Celine, the red mark, the hand mark, right? Which is significant to the story or the place they're going to go visit together and try to solve a mystery. So it's like from the beginning, there's that mark. Now that's what I find is also interesting, because, like you said, it's layers, right? So if you're the same person, there are different parts of you, but you're in a way, connected by certain things. But I also think it's interesting if you just look at it as separate people, right? Because the mark is kind of when someone talks about something they love and you love it too. So you see that mark, right? It's like I came to your home, I see some Blu-ray on your shelf or a book on your shelf that I love and stuff. It's a mark, and it draws you closer and intrigues you more about that person, because they like what you like, or they're exploring the same thing you're exploring, and then it starts building a foundation for a friendship. So I like that too, that the foundation of the friendship is built on could be built on a story, a piece of art, a literature, a kind of exploration, mutual boredom as well. any number of things. So that's also interesting about the two characters. And like you said, you never really know which one is the illusion, or maybe they're both the illusion. Uh, because at the end of the day, they might be the phantoms that they encounter as well from the stories they are visiting. So we're visiting their story, they're visiting another story. They get phantoms from that story, and then we're getting phantoms from their story, like that.
And if we look at their friendship in more detail, I think, are they really like really good friends in the end? I think their relationship in a way seems kind of very surface level, that they need these stories and these other people to come into their relationship and then they will have fun, but they don't actually find themselves or each other that interesting because they need that additional package to add to the relationship. So this kind of shows how human connection is an illusion as well, and how we are actually very alienated from each other and we can only form these surface level relationships, but then we just have to add these kind of big grandiose things on top of that to make us feel something, because we really struggle to feel anything for each other without that. So I think obviously alienation has become kind of like a classic theme of this podcast, like every film is about alienation. So it's kind of getting, I guess, a bit repetitive to talk about it, but I think this film also has that alienation layer to it.
Yeah. I'm like, I laughed because I'm not surprised you said that. And it's like, that's always one of the interesting things, is that you'll note certain things that, of course, you know I also noted, because yes, the film is celebrated as a film about friendship in some ways, in a very surface, not surface way. I actually don't need to denigrate it, but I mean, one way is can be seen as a celebration of friendship. But like you said, that's a very valid point, and I think, people who have experienced what we've experienced, uh, you have a very different definition of friendship, right? That would be like, okay, you're having fun together, but that's not really friendship, because I'm sure even in your life you've had fun with certain friends you've had, but then, based on certain truths or changes in your life, or whatever, when those friendships just disappear. So I don't know, Rivette could be being even more clever in saying friendship's an illusion. Right, at the end of the day, your true friendship is your imagination, your so yeah, I think. And you're right to say alienation, but let's talk about other words that relate to the same thing: solitude, loneliness. So it's an exploration of all those things, because imagination can come out of solitude and observation. um Stories and, literature, film, drama, are, take you out of your loneliness and connect you to a greater reality, and make you think about things and life, and people in a way maybe you can't really get by just interacting. Or maybe some people don't get that opportunity. So how would they know about other things that exist in the world if they weren't for these stories? So I think it's one of those bittersweet things, like you said. It's the connection, and then you can see the disconnection. Um, Albeit in beautiful sunshine in Paris and all that. So there's that romance there, and then they're kind of having a romance too, of sorts. Yeah.
And of course, friendship, it's not about just having laughs, but it's also about being there when there are no laughs and when there is only sadness and sorrow and depression. So to me, this really
Mm.
isn't, again, the ideal friendship that, yeah, you laugh together, you watch a movie together, but it's nothing else beyond that ever. It's nothing deeper. So that's, again, why I think it's kind of weird how people see this as some like great friendship, because there's so much more to friendship. This is more like a kind of like a casual acquaintance that you can have fun with, but yeah, you never share anything true about yourself or any of the darker sides of yourself. But yeah, I think I could also, we talked about the meandering nature of the film earlier, but that's again one of my problems with this film is that I think there are certain sections of the film when it meanders too much, even though I don't necessarily mind the rivet type of meandering in general, but here I think you could definitely cut some of the fat of this film and make it a little more concise. Again, Rivet made this film called Le Pont du Nord, which is one of my favorites, absolute favorites, and it's like a 2 hour film about two women walking in Paris, and it works way better when it's a bit
Mm.
shorter and not meandering. Although that film is quite different in many other ways, but yeah, I think yeah, definitely you could maybe take 15 minutes out of this film and make it better. Although I don't know what you would cut, and it's really weird when then there's like a section for 10 minutes that feels like really meandering, but then it jumps into something really interesting and fun and very like artistically beautiful. So it's kind of tonally very
Mm.
weird in that way. And of course, when we look at the story and when they are in the house, we can kind of see this genre bending here as well, because there's the murder thing there.
Mm.
There's a bit of again romance, kind of again thriller element, even maybe a slight horror element. And then we have these like again friendship kind of drama comedy there as well. Then we have surreal elements, so it's kind of a melting pot of so many different things. Just like there are so many different themes, there are also many of these stylistic and genre things as well.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I felt the same way. I was watching it and I said, I felt that at times. I was like, okay, do we need to go along on for as long as we need to? But yeah, having watched the whole film, I do feel like yeah, people would have challenge. Some people would have challenge with the length, and like you said, what feels like meandering. But in some ways, I'm like you. I feel for the logic they they're going for the meaning they're going for. I think it's right because creativity, and that's the challenge. I think when you get older and stuff, I think it is harder to tap into some of these things because your exploration, especially in childlike wonder, it is much more meandering. Like you're getting lost in something, and then something's got to play with the time element. So I think the length has something to do with playing with the time element, like really getting lost in the story, and then really getting consumed by it. And the replay. So sometimes it's at a point it's like VHS, right? Every time you watch something, then you rewind a bit to say, oh yeah, what just happened priorly, because you dive back in the story. You might go one page back, 2 pages back, and then forward, and then go back. And then there was this thing too that was mentioned in one of the discussions, or someone talking about that it's kind of supposed to be like that, like one step back, 2 steps forward, um like a certain kind of music. I don't know who was talking about that. Uh, so all that is there, and that's the problem. It's like I think they're going all in, which they should. I think great art only comes when you go all in, and then people are just going to have differing views about it. Some might say, well, it feels kind of self-indulgent, and some might say, no, it had to be that uh, to get you to create the full experience. Um, So yeah, it's difficult. It's really difficult to gauge this film, if I'm to be honest. Yes, subjectively, I can fully connect with it, but at the same time, I also see what they were trying to do, and if someone says, I think it's brilliant, I wouldn't disagree with them either, because that's what art is when you go all in. So you've picked two choices this week that are both like very all in films. Like the filmmakers are all in. They're not they're not like at the border having their foot in two different ponds. They're just like, that's it, like let's go for the whole thing. And you got to admire that. You got to admire that courage. I don't think you see that kind of courage now.
Yeah, and I started thinking about the meandering more. That I think again the meandering happens when the film is kind of less surrealistic and when they are maybe outside and stuff, but then when they are in the house and all that weird stuff is
Yeah,
happening
yeah,
there and the
yeah.
performativity is happening there, then it's more exciting. So it kind of says that when they are more in touch with reality, it's more meandering and boring, but then when they are inside the story, it's more exciting. So that kind of
Yeah.
goes back to the escapism element, that when we escape into other people's stories or again fictional stories, then our life is more exciting. But when we don't do that, life is just boring and meandering and slow and
Mm.
not much is happening.
Yeah. And it's a nice segue to talk about the world of the home they're going to, which is the place of the story they're visiting together. Uh, what did you think? So that's one of the challenges I really had, where the performance is in that story, because again, it's Rivette being playful, but what it seems to me what he was doing is, you go into the story, what the story is quite flat, right? It's supposed to be this Henry James-esque story, but it's very played very flat. Like it's like extreme deadpan, and like, so I found that stuff sometimes a bit trying for me, especially Barbet Schroeder, the way he played the father. Like, I get it, it's funny, he's kind of this ridiculous, like, flat, almost cardboard like figure, but then at the same time, it took, for me aesthetically, it took away the draw they must be feeling to, and the curiosity they must be feeling for that story.
Yeah, I have like some problems with it as well. Like just like with this film, some of it is very riveting and some of it is a bit too dry and kind of all over the place. But I kind of really like the pure visual aesthetic of some of those scenes, like how they like position the
Mm,
characters and things like that, and some of the backdrops and things like that. I like a lot. But actually, like when I was watching this film again, because I had seen it one time before, like years ago, like this time the experience was way different. Like like my memory of it was that the part when they start going to the house was like way more crazier, and that they constantly
mhm,
go through the doors and it repeats and repeats and repeats, and it
mm,
like has those, and every time it repeats it's a bit different. Like that's how I remembered it, but it ended up being way slower and kind of
mm,
less surrealistic than what I remembered.
mm,
So it kind of shows how different the experience for a film like this can be when you have a few years between those viewings. When it, yeah, it's just the film had kind of completely twisted on my mind throughout those years. Although I think because Rivet's films tend to be, many of them tend to be like this, they kind of
mm,
start blending in your mind. Because Duel, one of my favorites from him, has this idea of also like going through doors and like weird identities and things like that. So he likes exploring these things in many of his films. Yeah.
yeah, in some ways, now that you're sharing that, I am thinking about certain things as well. Because, as last weekend I went to see Satin Tango, and obviously Bellatar is someone's like who believes in the eternal must be present in the present mundane, in a way, and in a way, Rivette is a precursor to that, in a sense of, he's also putting the surreal in the very present mundane, in a way, right? Because, and then he's not putting the markers. So in a lot of films, my understanding is, I didn't even pay attention to this, but when I started reading about it, I started paying attention to more, is that what a filmmaker might do is, when you're entering another reality or a dream or something surreal, they're going to change the aesthetic. They're going to maybe change the focus of the camera. They're going to change the lighting. And so they're going to leave you little markers to say you have now changed, right? And of course, you can agree with that or disagree with that, because maybe sometimes it works, but maybe sometimes it's almost like you're distrusting your audience. Depends on the filmmaker, depends on the audience member. But like you're saying, this moving doors thing, right? It looks like the same reality, right? In terms of lighting and stuff. But what's different is, I guess, the actors. Um, but you're right. It seemed, I could see that you could remember that as being quite crazy. And it is crazy in a way, because it is quite, uh, it's like quite active and hectic, especially near the end when both of them are in there and they're switching being the nurse. So we can talk about that as well, because that's an argument for whether they're the same person, because sometimes one's the nurse and sometimes the other person's the nurse. And then you tie it back to the beginning of the film where she's telling the story, that how she's working for these people, and then there was this murder and they're running after her. So she's obviously distorted in the reality, or she's already starting to tell her this story that they enter. uh but yeah, I don't know. The perform It's still, I don't know, like the whole thing, the trio, like you said, that it's great for blocking, like you're saying, and that's a very theatrical thing. And if Rivette's very interested in theater, then of course blocking is such an important part of how you tell a story in theater, how you position people. um but I think it's also interesting that he stripped them down of all affect, which in theater you go the opposite. You dial up the affect because people in the back need to be able to feel the emotion or see the emotion on the actor. Whereas in film, you don't have to act that much for the camera, because the camera can zoom in and stuff. So I don't know what's going on there. All I know is that it left me a bit cold sometimes. That's the challenge I have. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so hard to talk about this film in many ways because it feels like there are like million puzzle pieces in your head,
Yeah.
but it's hard
Yeah.
to put them together.
Yeah.
And of course, when we
Yeah.
think about art, we talk about the doors and the rooms. Like that
Mm.
type of thing can symbolize so many different things. Like I
That's
started
true.
thinking about one of my favorite short stories by Edgar Allan Poe, like The Mask of
Mm.
the Red Death, and that like is something that where the rooms play a big part, and they kind of you could analyze them in that they are like different stages of life. And in this film, you could
Mm.
maybe think about how that there are different stages of the performance and from of the rehearsal and things like that, how it keeps developing and those two stories start developing and something like that. I started thinking, but I don't know, like it's hard to describe.
I think you're like you're onto something. Yeah. That makes sense to me. Yeah, the backstage, the preparation, the on stage, which part is on stage, which part is backstage, right? Because some part of the story is happening right in front, some part of the story is happening in the background. Okay, that's interesting. That's very interesting. Yeah. Well, like I said, yeah, even me, I just feel like I may have felt certain ways watching the film, but at the same time, I'm like, probably is a masterpiece. I haven't fully connected to the aesthetic. But yeah, it's a highly layered story that has been constructed, and it is amazing to act that they actually sat there and they constructed this whole narrative, and then we're going to do this and then we're going to do that. I mean, that requires a lot of awareness. um, and I think one of the challenges I had is when comparing, for example, to Romer, right? So, as I've discussed in previous podcasts, like, so Romer sometimes explores characters that I don't personally immediately connect with, or maybe in my life would feel like, oh, I'm not that interested by whatever that kind of character. But what happens is, like, the story unfolds and you learn more and more about the character, kind of like what's happening in this story, but that's the actual story. So you're kind of following these breadcrumbs along. Like, I'm thinking like Aviator's Wife, like, this following sequence, and then the story is like unfolding as there's this sequence going through all the streets of Paris, and they're like following, and then you're learning more and more and more about what's going on. It's like really brilliant. Um, so I enjoyed that, learning more and more about the person, because it built my ability for, I guess, empathy, or even caring a little more about something maybe I wouldn't really have thought about, and actually like gaining something from it. But as the point you're making, maybe the whole point in this thing is they are illusions, so we actually don't get depth in the character. So we're getting a different kind of exploration. We're not exploring depth. We're not gaining tons of depth. We're kind of staying, and maybe I'm wrong about that, so please correct me if you see it differently, but we don't really get depth. We get a certain amount of personal, but it doesn't really develop. And then these quirky situations happen, like with her cousin slash boyfriend slash fiance, and then you're like, did that really happen? Did that not really happen? Because it's like Céline shows up instead of Julian. There's, again, like you said, 1,000 puzzle pieces. What's real? What's constructed? What happened? What actually didn't happen? Did any of it actually really happen? Uh, of course not, because you're watching a film, so nothing of it really happened. So in a way, it is an illusion. You just watched an illusion. Nothing really happened in real life, but it has an impact in your real life, because we're talking about it right now, and we're constructing that world in 3D, sort of, and we're walking through it, and we're trying to discuss it, which is like we're Céline and Julie right now, in a way.
Yeah, I started like thinking even more and more about the rooms and the rehearsals,
Mm.
and now I start thinking that maybe the whole film is about the creative process,
Mm.
like how it starts with Julie following Céline, so that's kind of the start of the creative process, and then when they are in the house and bit by bit they learn more and more about the people there and the house, so that's kind of constructing the story. But then in the end, when the role reversal happens, then we kind of see how, like, oh god, like I don't know if how this works, but the the creator of the story, or the creator of this film, kind of looking at the finished product again and taking the like a role of the viewer, you could say, or the story, or something like that. Like I don't know. Like I started brainstorming about this, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. Like you're reading, like that's a very interesting reading too, about the creative process, because yeah, it is about creativity, and creativity is a form of magic, and then there are different ways. So yeah, maybe you have to go to a certain place to have that creative process as well, like what you're saying. um,
And then going into the boating element,
mm,
because we of course have talked about water and how it's like stream of consciousness when we talked about Tarkovsky, but here when they go through the water with the boat, and we also see the people from the story in the water, so that's kind of the going through the stream of consciousness, your creative process, that magic, and then
mm.
creating through that. So yeah, so there's even a connection to Tarkovsky there a bit.
Yeah, and I think there's something that relates to what you're saying, which I was just thinking about like this morning or yesterday. At the end, they they show up in their world or her world, the characters who they're going and visiting, but they don't look like themselves. They have this green paint, so obviously looking like some kind of phantom, some kind of monster. But another character I thought of that's kind of famous for being made up that way is Frankenstein. So, like you said, it is kind of the creative process, because them becoming Frank. So these are like things you're trying to create, because the Frankenstein story is Dr. Frankenstein creating this monster by collecting a bunch of pieces and then putting it together. And like you said, the film starts with like chasing these pieces and picking them up, and then going through this whole process of then bringing these pieces together and then into a narrative and a story, and all kinds of things in terms of You're absolutely right, because that makes sense. Your reading, that's definite. That's a great reading, because them going back and then it rewinding back and then it moves a little bit forward, but then it goes back. So that's definitely, I could see the creative process there, because you have to keep revisiting and you say, okay, where am I going to take this? Right? How is it going to end? And what's going to be the arc, and what's going to be the inciting event, and what is going to be the resolution, and what is going to, and then at the end you have these Frankensteins like floating on the water, like you said, consciousness in a boat. I think there's lots of evidence for your reading. I think that's a quite a brilliant reading, actually. And the film makes is quite concise in some ways when you take that reading that you're taking.
And now I even started thinking about the simulation theory that maybe we are just controlled by some alien
Mm.
species and we are just living inside like a computer story or whatever. So this is kind of, obviously this film is kind of like we live in a story in a way, and everything is illusion and magic, and we like our perception of reality might not be reality itself. So it might made me think of that. So,
Yeah, and then it adds the whole thing, right? If you're not real, and then you are constructing things that are not real, that really starts blowing your mind a bit, right? Like, I'm not sure of my reality, and then I create alternate reality within what might be an alternate reality, and all that. And now you, yeah, I mean, that's quite dizzying. So I think that definitely came across in the film, and the aesthetic and how it's constructed. It did feel a bit dizzying at times, where you're just, like you said, it's almost like a revolving dart. They're like going in and then they're coming out, and then going in and they're coming out. I like, that is one of the most challenge. That was really challenging when they're kind of sitting there and they're going for a bit and then they come out and then they go in for a bit and it's like another candy and then they go in and they come out and another candy and then they create another potion, and so that felt like so disconnected and dizzying. Um, but based on what you're saying, yeah, it's 100% by design, and you're kind of supposed to feel that way. So in that way, yeah, it succeeds in what it's doing. So back to that, what we were saying, could it have been shorter? Was it a bit meandering? Maybe not, because by design, it's doing the things it's supposed to do and make you feel. So, maybe it was designed exactly as what it's supposed to be. Who knows?
and the design has made me think maybe there's like a religious angle to this film as well, that you could analyze it
Yeah.
from, like the
Oh, yeah, yeah,
idea of intelligent design. And yeah,
yeah.
that's how you know that God exists, because everything is so particular and specific and
Yeah.
interesting. So no, that couldn't happen by chance or whatever. That made me think about that.
Mhm. Yeah, or even what you're saying about the creative process, and where we assign all that to a certain kind of intelligence. So there must be intelligence there if you create it. But if it's childlike wonder, we all know that children are building their intellect and rationality in some ways. They're all pure emotion. So what does that mean? Is it a product of intelligence? Is it a product of design, or is it a product of just suspending disbelief and living in wonder and being open to any possibility? I don't know. There are a lot of things going on. That's for sure. It's a very busy film, and it doesn't feel as busy as it is in terms of ideas.
And again, when we are creating something, the creator is kind of like a god, because you can choose whatever you want for your story. You can do whatever you
Yeah.
want, as long as you have the intellectual capacity to do it. And then talking about the childhood wonder, of course, again, I think I mentioned this maybe in the heroic purgatory chat when we talked about psychoanalysis a bit, but again, in psychoanalysis, we talk about how, again, children are the most creative,
Mm.
and then how to retain your creativity when you grow older is to retain that childhood wonder. So that childhood mentality, that child mentality. Yeah.
Mm.
But
Interesting.
I, yeah, but I think if you don't have anything else to say, maybe we can start wrapping this discussion up.
Yeah.
Also, this is something you could talk about for hours and hours, but it's just breaking my brain in half, like trying to talk about this. And the next film isn't gonna be any easier. So
Yeah. But yeah, I'll definitely take some time, and then I will watch this again. Because, like we discussed before, it's really not about liking or disliking it, especially first time. I don't trust first time like or dislike in a way, because unless it's the most obvious things, because at the end of the day, your brain is still adjusting and dealing with what it's seen. So things can change. You can come back to something, like you said, you thought it was much more busier, or exciting, like lots going on, and then this time you experienced it different. And so yeah, but based on our interesting discussion, yeah, it's worth revisiting again in the future, and then just kind of seeing, okay, with all this that we've discussed and things that you've kind of put into my brain, what do I see now? So yeah, thank you.
yeah, and I was thinking earlier that this would have been a film that it would have really benefited from, like if I watched it like maybe a couple of times before this chat, because it's the type of film that you would really benefit if you like remembered like every single scene like exactly as it is, and because there's just so many small things that affect the whole theme of the film and stuff.
Yeah, true. I agree. Yeah, I agree.
But anyway, it was an interesting discussion, and we will certainly come back to Rivet at some point. Obviously, we talked about the Nun earlier in the year, and that was a great discussion as well. And that's a bit easier film, and I do prefer that film to Céline and Julie co-boating. But yeah, this one is also very interesting, very good. But maybe there are some small problems with it. But we'll see in the future when we both watch it more times. But
True.
anyway, in the next episode, we will talk about Fellini's Satyricon, so that will be very interesting as well. Yeah. But yeah, thanks for watching. Let us know what you think about Céline and Julie boating, or Jacques Rivet, or French New Wave. Don't drink Coke at all. Sayonara and arigato gozaimashita.